This is the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth. If there's one place in Britain, one place in the world that is the collected memories of the ocean, it's here. It's the collective consciousness about the marine environment. And it's never better illustrated than in this room. So come and have a look at this. So this is a book from the 16th century written about the sea. It's all written in Latin. This is a book from the 17th century. And best of all, for me personally, this is an original copy of The Origin of Species. Look at that, 1860, and it was published in 1859 by Charles Darwin. So there we are. And it's a very special place, this. But what goes here? That's the important point, because this is history, and what this place does as well is look at the future, and that's what I'm going to go and find out today.
Starting in 1931, the Continuous Plankton Recorder Survey is the longest running and most geographically extensive marine monitoring programme in the world. The CPR survey has now towed over 7 million nautical miles. The data is used to drive policymakers on areas such as pollution, climate change and fisheries.
Well, we've actually got a Guinness World Record for being the longest and most extensive marine biological survey in the world.
Wow,
yeah.
Wow. So what is that data telling you?
Well, primarily it's telling us all about the plankton, and that's what it was initially designed for by Sir Alister Hardy back in the 1920s. So he was on a ship called the Discovery that went down through the Atlantic, and they were looking at fisheries and whale populations. And he said, well, if we want to know where the whales are, we need to know where the plankton are. So he designed this torpedo to be towed off the back of the ship, and he designed this internal cassette here, which has essentially a rolling silk, natural silk fibres that capture the plankton on a kind of silk sandwich. Those are then sent back to the lab, and we're able to look and identify what's there and where they are.
There are two different types of plankton. So there are thousands of species of plankton, and we can broadly split them into the two main types. There's the phytoplankton, which is the plant plankton, and the animal plankton, the zooplankton. And here we look at both the phytoplankton and the zooplankton.
It is the basis of everything.
Absolutely, yeah. Without the phytoplankton, pretty much we wouldn't have any other big marine life, or most marine life in the ocean actually. So it produces oxygen for us. About 50% of the oxygen on the planet is produced by the phytoplankton. So just without the phytoplankton, we wouldn't have multicellular animals. We wouldn't be here without the phytoplankton.
That's an amazing fact. That so half of every breath that you're taking as you watch this comes from phytoplankton, comes from the sea. There is a perception that plankton is, obviously it's tiny, and I learned this a couple of days ago. It's isn't it drifter? It's
yes.
Latin for drifter.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, and we're plankton, by the way, because we can't swim against the big ocean currents. We drift. We're drifters.
I float at the moment as well.
Yeah, we are defined as plankton.
The silk gets rolled out. So at this point, the silk is still trapped in the machine. The silk will then get unrolled out. It's a long piece of silk, and we have to chop that up somehow to make it analysable. So we chop it up into sections. We count the different species that we see, and we count their abundance. And from that we can produce what's called distribution maps. And so because we've been running for so long, over 90 years now, we know when to expect a certain type of plankton and in what area. And what we're seeing is that these guys are moving in response to warming sea surface temperatures.
But these long-term shifts that we're seeing since the 50s is definitely more of an impact that we're having on our environment.
Would you say that what you're seeing is unequivocal?
Definitely, yes. It's across most of the taxa, particularly if they have an affinity to a certain warmer or colder region. And you see it not just from the plankton, but all the way up through the food chain. So you see it through fisheries, marine birds, and up to some of the larger marine mammals.
We think in very simplistic terms about the sea, and we think, right, temperature's going up, bad. And actually, the temperature is just one factor. You know, as you
That's
say,
right.
You've got salinity, ocean acidification, you've got light, you've got temperature, you've got so many things. And most marine organisms, it strikes me, particularly in this part of the world, are pretty good at dealing with environmental stress because the water temperature range is so vast anyway, and conditions it's a pretty harsh environment. How are you finding that the marine organisms you're studying are dealing with the changing temperatures and the stress?
Well, some are really impressing us actually with what they can tolerate. And Plymouth in general is quite an interesting place to study a lot of these kind of questions because we're the southerly limit for a lot of the kind of northern species that don't like it too warm, and we're the northerly limit for a lot of southern species that like it kind of warmer. And this is why we see a lot of kind of interesting species turn up, like we can get like Octopus vulgaris, for example, turning up en masse. So the species we're studying can deal with these temperatures sometimes really well. We have, for example, Pacific oysters, which we used as part of a heat wave experiment last year, which we've really struggled to kill. We ramped up the temperature by 2 degrees. But this is what we're basically testing, is those kind of ultimate thermal tolerances. At what point are these animals going to stop surviving in the kind of conditions? So we ramp up the temperature by 2 degrees per day to look at some of the smaller interactions they have, things like their physiology with the kelps, how well they're photosynthesizing, but ultimately we want to see just how hot can these species survive. And Pacific oysters, very, very happy in the 30s, hard as nails.
So what is the trend? What are you seeing? What are all these things around us telling you about what's happening to the environment they live in?
Well, I think what we're seeing, which is I think really interesting but also makes it really difficult to forecast what's going to happen in the future, is every species is responding differently.
These are our native seagrasses. So Pacific oysters, it's great that they can hack up to 40 degrees, but they are an invasive species. I mean, they're very widely spread and they're pretty much ubiquitous. Whereas seagrasses, we know, are already under threat from fishing activities, from trawling, dredging, from recreational boats putting down anchors. They're obviously a vital habitat for a number of different marine species locally, but they are also much more sensitive to things like temperature changes compared to a lot of other kind of species.
And that's a problem, isn't it? You're gearing up down here for the challenges ahead.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying to do in this
That's
lab.
absolutely it. And we are hoping with our work not only to understand these species, but also working with people like the Cornish Seaweed Farm to actually look at cultivation and look at ways that you can actually then positively impact the marine environment, potentially by culturing some of these species.
The information you're getting from the environment is that change is unequivocally afoot.
Yes, and whether you come from warmer waters originally or cooler waters, everything's shifting north as the seas are warming.
Is action happening because of the data you're presenting?
Yeah, I think that's the good thing about having that direct link to the policymakers, not just in the UK but also in Europe, because we're part of European projects, is we're able to take the information and tell them what's happening. We can make suggestions, but it's really nice when you see actual policy decisions being made based on what you're doing on the assessments you've made, and then you think it was worth getting up in the morning.
Yes. Thank you very much. Feel like jumping in.
On you go. I'm going to stay here.
Yeah.
I know what the temperature of the water is.
Yeah, yes you do. I imagine you do.
Not going in.
You of all people.
Not going in.